Hi, I'm John Paul and a really warm welcome back to my channel. This is going to be the second part of the videos about red flags. The first one you might remember is about some potential red flags. This one is going to be about why we might not see them when we go into a relationship with someone, and also then subsequently, if either we see them or somebody else points it out or a mixture of both, why we might continue in relationship with the person and endure them or deny them. And then I'm going to continue in the third video to talk about what we can do about that to avoid doing that if that's something that we do want to avoid. Looking at initially why we might not recognize them, I think we need to go back for that and look at a lot of people's early experience. Early experience, our caregivers, who we grew up with, were the people that set the example, I suppose, of what we can expect as far as loving behavior in relationship. And I want to distinguish again, just to quickly say, as I did in the first video, between somebody loving you, that kind of attachment and bond that's underneath, but then the most important thing, as far as what we're going to expect, whether we see red flags or not, what are green flags to us, is how loving somebody was on top. And that is an emotional skill that looks like certain qualities being demonstrated. That is empathy, that's attunement, all those kind of things, with protection as well, and I'm going to come on to that too. So our example was set mostly in early experience by people. So often, though, what was modelled by caregivers for people was not actually that loving at all. So there may have been controlling behaviour, which we were told was loving, a lot of anger about, and people were told that somebody was getting angry because they loved us, that kind of thing. And those are all, as I've talked about in the first video, part of being human and part of relationships too. But I think the thing that prepares a lot of people for going into relationships where they don't notice that there are problems is that they were always in kind of caregiving relationships where there were problems and red flags. Therefore, it's familiar for them. You don't know something or miss something that you've never had if you've never felt that safe in relationships. If relationships have often felt like they're characterized by feeling unsafe or annoyed or frustrated, you won't know what it feels like, I suppose, to be more often than not in that place of connection with self, more contentment, aliveness, peace, joy, those kind of things. So people don't even know what it feels like in their bodies to experience that. And as I say, go into relationships with other people where these red flags are around and then don't particularly notice it. I mean, using some specific examples from childhood, how this might get set up. If you look at a situation which can be quite familiar, so say you have one frightened caregiver and one angry caregiver, if you look at what happens then, the effect of that, and there's a child in the middle of that, the frightened caregiver is most often looking at the angry caregiver because they know that their happiness and everybody's happiness largely depends on that caregiver being okay. So their focus is going there. If you're looking therefore at the child, we get our sense of self as children, who we are and what's of worth and value about us, largely from caregivers. It's an outward in process. And of course, if you've got a frightened caregiver, they largely sit in fear often, so they're probably problem focused when they're looking at the child. So they're identifying problems, maybe focusing on problems when they're talking to the child. And if you have an angry one, equally, when they look at the child, if that's the lens through which they're looking at them, they'll be annoyed by the child often. So you can see, what is that child going to be able to internalize as far as a sense of self, as far as self-esteem? Probably not very much at all, and might at times see themselves as a problem. Then of course you go delivered into romantic relationships with somebody with these red flags, who, as I've talked about in the first video, because they don't take responsibility often, one of that being a red flag, they will often see you as, say, a perpetrator if you challenge or criticize them. So those childhood dynamics where someone was seen as a problem or seen as annoying, it just gets repeated with these people. It's familiar to go into a relationship with somebody with red flags who sees you in that way too. Clearly as well, for a child to be in an environment which doesn't feel that good and feels unsafe at times means that they probably have to disconnect from their felt experience of things in order to remain, and that disorientates people in life. The way in which their feelings can contribute to their compass in life and the decisions they make, it gets compromised, very significantly compromised during childhood. And again, you therefore go into romantic relationships later on in life with that inner compass not quite working in the way that it could. As I've said earlier, you're used to these relationships being stressful and annoying, and you're used to somebody saying that you're the problem if you raise any difficulty. It's all compounded, of course, by the fact that children have to stay. They can't go, they have no choice. That's why they have to separate from their felt experience of things because, well, a couple of things. They can't survive without the caregivers. Also, the message that's coming back from the caregivers is it is their fault, it is their problem, that they should put their feelings out of the way in order to keep this environment steady. So people learn to hide their own feelings. People learn that it's selfish to say what they want or don't want, or if they're struggling with something, or they don't like something that's going on in the relationship, or they really like something that's going on in the relationship, that becomes secondary. It becomes a situation where somebody's conditioned into seeing caregiving relationships as if I'm okay if you're okay. And again, you can really see how that prepares somebody for certainly familiarity there, and not noticing that that is something that's not inevitable and not necessary in life. Because they have to stay. They have no choice. You have no choice as a child. And that part continues through for people, I think. And we're going to come on to the reasons why, some other reasons why people stay. But there very much is that conditioned response that you have no choice with a caregiver, certainly with your parents. So you may be told that if you persist in saying there's a problem as a child, that you're rocking the boat, that you're the problem. Of course, children of themselves have narcissistic qualities, so they believe the world revolves around them, really. That's part of being a child. And therefore, if an annoyed parent is looking at them with an annoyed face, a child will believe that they're annoying. If a frightened parent, a fearful parent, is looking at them with a kind of a problem-focused or critical face, they will believe that they are to be criticised or they're problematic. Children don't have the capacity, they're not aware of narcissism, or they're not aware of kind of personality types or potentially difficult or problematic personality types in their parents. They will always assume that they're the problem. So they'll always assume that if they're not loved by parents, or the parents aren't loving towards them, that they're unlovable. Similarly, you can see how this all sets us up, disorientates us, adversely affects our internal compass, and means it's very difficult to make judgments and decisions based on feelings when we get into romantic relationships as we get older. Other confusing things that happen during childhood as well, possibly, is that you might see, say, a narcissistic parent being very nice to other people. I mean, if somebody's consistently angry to everybody, then in some ways as a child you can orientate yourself around that. But if somebody, a parent, is lovely to everybody else, but for narcissistic reasons, so that public-private split that I was talking about, again, a child doesn't know the concept of narcissism. What they see is a parent who's able to be loving and kind and good-humoured to other people, but looks at them with anger and with a problem focus and criticism. That compounds the problem even more, doesn't it? Because it makes the child believe that they are, unlike everybody else in the world, somehow not deserving of love. They really must be the problem, because that person has the capacity to love and like and be liked by other people and to charm other people, but they're not doing it with them. So it must be them that's the problem. Another thing to say here, which can be disorientating as well and adversely affect our internal compass, is love might be very conditional. Remember somebody saying to me that their parents said to them that they could be a lawyer, a doctor, or an engineer, or a failure. And I think they said that laughing. They thought that was funny because I guess, and I'll come on to that sort of seriousness and joking as well in the third video, I guess that's what they needed to do to remain somehow in relationship with their parents and believe perhaps that their parents were loving, because their parents would say probably that that's a loving thing to say because they want the best for their child. But actually, what that will do, it's okay if you're a lawyer, isn't it, or want to be a lawyer, that's your congruent, authentic path in life. But if it isn't, if your congruent, authentic path in life is an artist or a landscape designer or something like that, you will believe that it is of less value. In fact, it's a problem to be who you are. So you either go and be who you are and are a problem and your parents disapprove, or you give up of yourself and do something which is not in line with what you feel or your interests or all of who you are in life. Both of those things can be a real problem for people, and again can disorientate them, can disconnect them from their internal compass, can sort of break their internal compass and sends them into relationships where they're very disorientated about who they're looking at and why and who's the problem. And am I the problem? Are they the problem? And really feeling like there's no way out. They struggle to trust their own judgment. And it's not just going to be manifesting in romantic relationships too. It's probably throughout in life. Okay, so that's how early experience might set us up for it, sets us up in that way, delivers us into romantic relationships where these things are familiar for us, so we don't even notice. Although we know we don't feel good, we've never really felt that good, so we don't notice and perhaps we stay. And then very importantly, let's bring it up to date. If we're talking about falling in love with somebody in a romantic sense, the effect of love on people and how that will do this. What's very key, there's this initial period if we're talking about two people falling in love with each other. I mean, some people don't get into relationships for that reason, but often we would say that that's what we do, or certainly what we would want, two people falling in love. The whole term falling is very key here, I think, because actually it's kind of an involuntary act. Of course, to pursue the person, to pursue the relationship is a voluntary act that we do, but actually the fact that that person puts us into a part of ourselves which is the one about love and connection, we couldn't stop that happening and we can't make it happen. It's something that happens to us really outside of our control. And I think the key thing about that is that therefore it's not necessarily who we are in a default sense. And that's the same thing of the other person. If we're talking about going into a relationship with somebody who has these red flags, if they fall in love with us, they've moved into that place of connection, love of self, love of others. And that place, they feel whole, the world feels great, it's good self-esteem, and it's the same for us too. So you can really see that they wouldn't necessarily even show in the early stages those parts of themselves which subsequently become red flags, because the bit with the red flags tends to be about the kind of competition and winning, that being dominant, as I talked about in the first video, or the fear and anger being dominant. Those are not the territory of love and being in love. But the trouble is that period lasts for only a relatively short period of time in the relationship, say 6 months, 9 months, up to a year, something like that. It's always going to be temporary. Often people will say, I wish I could go back to what it was like at the beginning, or what they were like at the beginning. I think that is never going to be possible. We're never going to be able to get back to that place of initially kind of falling in love. Absolutely, it's possible, and I'm going to talk about that in the next video as well, to occupy that part of ourselves much more often, and for the other person to do that. And of course, therefore, we will be loving, and we will be easy to love and find it easy to love others. But I don't think that happens outside of our control in the way that it does at the beginning. So there's some aspect of that falling in love where we see the best of that person, we show the best of ourselves, and we therefore form these beliefs about them based on that sort of exceptional, temporary state. Then, of course, after that sort of 6, 9, 12 months, the cracks start to show, the red flags start to show. At that stage, we'll probably have a confirmation bias as well about that person. So we'll select that information that fits with this view of them that we developed at the early stages of the relationship. For people, falling in love is such a profound shift as far as our internal experience of ourselves and the world. If you're looking at growing up in the kind of environment that I've described, there's a lot of conflict. We might have low self-esteem, struggle to trust ourselves, struggle to trust others. The profound difference that we feel when we fall in love with another person. People remember the first person they fell in love with for the rest of their lives, I think, because it's such a significant shift, relief, I suppose, and into joy, and feeling at one with the world, and that they have self-esteem, which up until that point was very difficult for people to experience. Suddenly, outside of their control, they're able to do that for a period of time. And people really want to keep hold of that, and really want to keep hold of the story that they've developed about the other person that supports those feelings in them. So I think when the cracks start to show, if they start to show, then we'll have a confirmation bias and just select those things that fit with the story that we've developed. Of course, during that period, because it's such a profound change for people as far as their state, for both people will do big things, make big life changes during that period. So they might move in together pretty early on, they might get engaged, they might even have children, and all of these things, they'll intertwine their friendship groups, their families, because this is the best person I've ever met in the world, and we're soulmates, and we both feel that about each other, let's do that. And therefore there's all this pressure based on things we start to set up as well during that period, understandably, on the basis of what we've been looking at here, but that makes it much more difficult when things, red flags start to show, to take things apart, doesn't it? If you've linked yourself together financially, or you're having a child, those kind of things. So we might start to make excuses for things that are starting to show. Wishful thinking starts to cloud our better judgment. I will talk a bit about love and imagination, which I think is very important here. Just to say, I don't think it's inevitable, of course, that after that initial period that people revert to these kind of red flags type situations. The two situations in which somebody wouldn't is if they grew up in my understanding of things, with a very well-loved being. There are certainly people that do that. Or, and I've mentioned it in other videos as well, they've sort of earned that well-loved sense of self through all kinds of things, through therapy, through other personal development type things, through spiritual practices, whatever it might be. So I think once, for them, the kind of initial chemicals wear off, if somebody's had a well-loved brain or has earned that love, internally, once the chemicals dissipate, once that initial falling in love experience changes, they're going to remain more often than not in that place of love. But unfortunately, I don't think that's a lot of people. And of course, if you're talking about a situation where you're noticing red flags in somebody, it probably wasn't them. So I think you can see how the act of falling in love with somebody as well really compounds this too. Being in love with somebody makes us feel connected, rewarded, and safe. It meets our needs, all of our needs, top down. And what's very important here, therefore, is being in love with somebody makes us feel safe, which means it kind of disables that protective part of us. It's not working with them. We're not looking out for the problems because we feel safe. The very act of occupying that love part of us, it's not the place of problems. As I've said before, the place of problems and identifying problems is that of our survival part. And when we're in love with somebody, initially, that's not what we're occupying. So we won't see any potential problems. Another thing which is interesting here, I think, is the general view of love and those kind of messages that we get externally about love for a lot of people. Those messages around about love, understandably, because that's what it's like when you're actually in that loving part of self, is that love is kind, love is patient, love always perseveres, love always trusts, love always hopes. And you can see, therefore, in the always in that, it's almost an imperative to continue to keep trusting somebody, to continue to keep persevering in the relationship, and to continuing to keep hoping that something's going to be different. Now, I think we all want to be in that love place. A lot of what I talk about as far as therapy and in the book, Finding a Balanced Connection and Life Unlimited, is about occupying that love place, that connection place, much more. The difficulty is, I think what we don't want is, I just mentioned it a minute or two ago, is for us to love at our own cost. And that can happen if we are always persisting, always trusting, always hoping, when the other person is somehow got these red flags and is problematic in that way. I've talked about people potentially, some people betray trust. There are sociopathic people, there are people with highly narcissistic traits, and to always persevere with them, to always trust them, to always hope, meaning that you remain in some sort of romantic relationship with them. I think love can be used against people there. We don't want our love, our sort of dream of love, to be used against us. And some people will do that. So I think we want to avoid love being sort of used, or people pressuring us to remain in that love part when it's at the expense of us protecting ourselves and taking care of ourselves. Because if you're a very empathetic person surrounded by lots of empathetic people who therefore probably occupy that love place much more, if you start to criticize that person or say with the red flags and say, you want to leave the relationship, people will say, you keep hoping, keep persevering, keep trusting, it's going to be okay. And I will talk about that in the next video as well. Maybe it will. But the thing is, maybe it won't. So where is that part which saying, no, this is a problem, this needs to change, and if this doesn't change, this is what's going to happen? Where is that part? We actually need to make sure, our fear and our anger are not disabled by love itself and by other people putting pressure on us to be loving, to be kind. Next thing here, generally, I just mentioned it, but love in imagination, fear in imagination means we catastrophize, personalize things that aren't personal, make things permanent that aren't permanent. Anger in imagination is going to be arguments. Love in imagination means we imagine that somebody has all of these qualities that they may not have. They may just not even be present. Sometimes, if I'm looking at that confirmation bias, if we're in love with somebody and they're just not expressing empathy ever, for example, not attuning ever, love in our imagination will probably say, well, they are thinking those things, they just don't express them. They just haven't been in environments before where they haven't expressed it. And that's potentially true. It may also be true, though, that they absolutely don't. see the world in the same way that you do, that they don't have empathy to the same degree that you do, and perhaps they want to develop that over time. Again, I'm going to talk about that in the third video, but perhaps they don't. But what love, I think, in imagination will often do is imagine that they will imagine that they possess qualities, loving qualities, that they just may not. Will imagine that the love runs much deeper within them than actually it does if you look at their behaviour. Also, another thing that love in imagination does is imagine that we can sort of fix somebody or change somebody. Now, to love somebody profoundly changes their experience. To be loved is the most healing thing in life for somebody, potentially. It really does change people to be loved unconditionally by somebody else. And very empathetic people know that. Equally, it's important to recognise, isn't it, that we can't love somebody into very significant psychological change, I don't think, if they don't want to, and if they're not actually proactively doing things on a day-by-day basis in order to achieve that change themselves. So love and imagination, thinking, they've had a series of difficult relationships in the past, very difficult childhood, that it's going to be different with us, possibly, but I do think a lot of that is love and imagination. Unless, of course, we're actually seeing them making proactive, conscious effort to make the changes that are necessary in terms of relationships with themselves, but also others themselves. Also importantly here, most people are a mixture, aren't they? So they will be showing difficult qualities, red flags, but also at other times could be caring and loving. So you can really see how it's not an all or nothing with people. When you're telling friends, you'll probably say the problems and they're saying, this person's a problem, you need to leave. But you know them. You know the range of experience they might be having. You know the range of the experience from a feeling point of view that you have with them. So I think that can complicate things as well, can't it? And as I've said about this confirmation bias and being in love with somebody, we'll tend to select those bits that fit with our story, that it's going to work out, that this is going to be okay, that we should keep trying, that we should keep persevering, that we should keep trusting them. So yes, very empathetic people will project empathy onto others. I just mentioned it a few minutes ago, but we do tend to project ourselves onto other people often in relationships. And very empathetic people who think in that way will be imagining that other people often will think in that way too. Because also for very empathetic people, they see how well it works in relationships. Often, that being more in connection, forgiveness, understanding, empathy, attunement, kindness, those things, they do have a significant kind of payback in life. So it's difficult to imagine why somebody wouldn't be doing that. But as I'll go on to talk about in the third video, some people certainly aren't. It's just not present. And even if it's offered to them, and even if they have the opportunity to and they can, they still won't do it. Just the last thing to say here about love as well. If you're looking at being in relationship with somebody who's quite narcissistic, the view that they have of themselves will often be that they are loving and that they are really good partners and that they are good parents, for example. So it is confusing as well, because what you'll be getting back from the other person is all this information selected which supports the fact that they are great parents, probably ignoring the red flags in themselves. It is a quality, you might say, of narcissism that they struggle to accept, a difficult reality. So their reality selects those things which fit with the story, that they are actually kind and loving, and that's what they'll be delivering to you as well. So again, you can see from a kind of wishing and hoping and a confirmation bias point of view that you will be hearing potentially the things that you want to hear too. So lots around love there. Moving on to fear. I put fear second here, and the things that frighten people into remaining. Even when they recognise something, they might endure or even deny. Fear is put second here, but actually, as I've said in other videos as well, fear will be the one we take care of first. We're programmed to take care of survival first. So anything that's around fear is very intrusive, very compelling for us, and probably comes above love as well. So anything here is of real significance. And if you think of the kind of fears that coming out, say, of a romantic relationship or becoming estranged from parents can bring up from people, you can really see how fear keeps people in places, keeps people denying things, keeps people enduring trauma even. So what are some of those fears? Of course, there's a fear of the unknown. If you're going out of existing relationships, leaving somebody, what's the unknown like? A lot of people who are anxious will feel the unknown with catastrophe and problems. I grew up hearing a phrase, better the devil you know. So you know that this person, their problems, their difficulties, their red flags, you could leave, but you might get worse. That again, it's a fear, isn't it? It's playing on a fear, and it's true. It is possible that someone would be worse, but it's possible that they wouldn't. But these fears do keep people in places. Fear of being alone, fear of being single, the kind of environment out there as far as dating and that kind of thing. It's not a very safe, enjoyable environment that a lot of people talk about. So people perhaps would rather stay with the status quo and endure something than be out there in something very new and different where they feel unsafe. People perceive that it'd be a failure, say relationships, marriage. I don't really buy that concept of success, failure in terms of relationships, but it is something that's very present for people generally in life, a fear of failure. People get fearful that that person with the red flags will actually, when the relationship is over, go and meet somebody else and be really happy with them, as if, I think it must be love in imagination. They think that they will be somehow happy with somebody else. I think implied in that must be somehow that I see myself as a significant part of the problem, but that definitely can be a fear that, what is the fear there is that I was the problem in some ways, and that was why the relationship didn't work out. But it's definitely this fear is potentially present for some, that once the relationship is over, if we split up, they will go and have this joyous life, like there's some kind of prize that's going to go somewhere else and have this amazing life for somebody else. Talking about the other person and fear for them, the person who, say, has the red flags in this situation, empathetic people who can often couple up with somebody who is, for example, narcissistic, they will worry about that person if the relationship comes to an end too. They might fear for them, their mental health, their emotional well-being. They really do worry about them, which really fits with this dynamic that can work in these kind of red flag relationships. If I'm happy, if you're happy. The other fear, of course, if you're in a relationship with somebody who's quite narcissistic, it's probably not going to end well. And therefore, if you go through a divorce or just a separation, they could crush you, annihilate. A lot of people with very narcissistic tendencies can have lots of material wealth, status, that kind of thing, and that could be used against you in legal processes. You also know probably if somebody's quite narcissistic and this public-private split, publicly, people will think they're really nice and great people, because they are very nice to people externally often. So what they'll be saying about people. You'll potentially be made the problem. That therefore adversely affects possibly your social groups. People have fear of stigma, coming out of relationships, fear of going against social norms. Just all really understandable fears, I guess, in the circumstances, in the kind of environments that we live in. And then, of course, if you're in fear or anger a lot of the time, a lot of people will shut down at that point, who may at a point get under-aroused, you might say. And that is the place potentially of depression, where people will be experiencing hopelessness, helplessness. And you can really see as well that to experience hopelessness and helplessness is going to really fit with staying in these environments. People feel trapped, like they can't get out. What's the point anyway? They wouldn't meet anybody new, they wouldn't meet anybody better, and then all of these fears get listed as to how it would be worse, actually. Just to finish up with a couple more, I haven't mentioned the rewards and the drives. They can be very significant for people, of course. We all have this part of us that likes drive, status, money, the other things that people can see. It's more or less a value in people. But if you're looking practically at taking a house or a marriage apart, you'll need to split the house, you'll need to split the finances, the pensions, all those kind of things. And that does, I think, that's a factor for a lot of people in terms of staying somewhere. At least when they're in this place, they can sort of tolerate that behaviour of the person who's showing the red flags, but they have all this lovely stuff as far as the house and the cars and those kind of things. Then next can be shame. Just to finish off with that, the whole idea that I may have been hoodwinked by somebody that may not have realised, loved somebody who didn't love me as much as I thought they loved me. That can bring up a lot of shame for people, unfortunately. Also, if you're realising that somebody is not the person you thought they were, there is grief, there's heartbreak, accepting that that person is somehow in a different psychological type, personality type than you thought. That gap feels like something. Very empathetic people can feel heartbreak, loss, grief, and perhaps, we would not want to or struggle to tolerate shame, grief, heartbreak. So somehow we would just rather maintain the illusion that that person is a particular way. And then finally, of course, what people do, human beings are very resourceful. Empathetic people have often good skills as far as relationships and that kind of thing. So what they might often do is just get their needs met, say for intimacy, attunement, empathy, outside of the relationship. Well, of course, that may possibly be in an affair, but actually it could just be friendships with people where they have the closeness, they have the intimacy, the nurturing, the support, and that enables them to go back into the relationship where they're not that present, but they're having that need met somewhere in life. Their need for connection. So I suppose they get the connection need met externally, but then they get the, say, protection and provider met within, for example, a romantic relationship. Okay, so lots of reasons I think you can see: love, drive, fear, shame, lots of reasons why, well, at least initially, we might not see the problems, and then why we might choose to endure and deny them. And I do think it's really key to see that it's very human to do that. I think it's key from the point of view of empathy for ourselves, because often, I've talked about the shame there, that people might think there was something wrong with them, or how could I do that, or why do I continue to do this? People get annoyed with themselves, frustrated, angry with themselves, embarrassed at the fact that this is happening. But I hope what you would take from this, if it is a position you're in now or you have been in the past, that it is very human. There are so many pressures as far as, from our physiological being to culturally, the way things have been set up, that keep people in that situation. But what I want to say is, of course, it's not inevitable, and that's what the third video is going to be about. So the next one's going to be about, if you do want to avoid doing this, it doesn't necessarily mean leaving the relationship, but if you do want to avoid remaining in places where you're getting less of the love than you deserve, then what can we do about that? And as I say, that's what I'm going to talk about in the next video. I hope that's been helpful. As ever, I would love to have your ideas about any of this issue. Please either put comments below the video, or of course write to me separately, and I can talk about things on here too. Please do like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. Share it to anybody who you think might find it helpful. Thank you for watching. You take care, and I'll see you again soon.